What is a part of history that we consider to be a fact is 100% a fake. Corsets were not typically tight-laced. They were only tight-laced by the highly fashionable women, and usually only for particular events or portraits. Corsets were designed to be comfortable. Women wore a cotton layer underneath the corset, so it didn't rub against the skin. The corset was more like a bra, but instead of using the shoulders to support it, used the whole torso. Some people claim they are much more comfortable than modern bras. The intense proportions of the past were achieved with corsets and padding. Tight lacing was uncommon, but layers of petticoats or hoops or bum rolls or whatever else at the time was very common to give women the trendy body shape at the time. The image of Roman gladiators fighting to the death. While there were many exhibition fights in the arenas where the goal was death, these were not gladiator contests. Prisoners and the condemned were thrown out to fight to the death, but not real gladiators. Training a gladiator was an expensive and lengthy investment, and having them die constantly would be bad for business. If a gladiator ended up dying in the arena, the guy who sponsored the games would have to reimburse the gladiator school. It was really more like choreographed combat than anything. Gladiators practiced spectacular but useless moves to make the crowd gasp. There's a very thorough and interesting display in the Roman amphitheater in Nimes, France, that dispels a lot of these myths. William Howard Taft never got stuck in a bathtub. That the Spanish Armada was destroyed. They did lose 44 ships out of 137, and the British also didn't beat them off with a small force. Their navy was actually significantly larger, with 197 ships, since they were joined by the Dutch Republic. A decisive defeat. Yes, a small English force, overcoming and obliterating the might of the entire Spanish and Portuguese navy. Ned Kelly's last words being "such is life." That was made up by the reporter. So many Aussies have it tattooed or have big stickers on their forksfors, but I guess "oh well" doesn't have the same ring to it. I like "oh well" low. Paul Revere did not run around Massachusetts shouting the British are coming, because if he did, everyone would look at him like he'd lost his mind. Almost everyone in the colonies was British. He actually said, "the regulars are coming." The law I was taught growing up was that the redcoats are coming. He also only carried that message for a small stretch of the ride. There were about a half-dozen messengers passing it along. We remember Paul Revere as the only rider because, no joke, his name fit best in Longfellow's poem, Edit. Longfellow, not Irving. The lady who sued McDonald's didn't do so frivolously. She received third-degree burns from how hot that coffee was and needed a skin graft. It was quickly found that that location was keeping the coffee well above the temperature you can legally serve a hot drink in a cup at. The fact that most people think this suit was over the temperature of the coffee and not the debilitating burns that woman received is one of the power world's greatest triumphs. You are not immune to propaganda. It was actually found that McDonald's had all of their locations keeping coffee temps too hot. Multiple reports of burns were placed before the main incident and were just settled out of court and ignored by the court. The poor woman just wanted enough money to cover her medical bills and nothing more originally. We actually learned about this at my middle school as a kind of cautionary tale about rushing to judgment and taking things at face value. It was first presented to us like a woman spilled McDonald's coffee on herself and sued the company for millions of dollars. Discuss whether you think she was in the right, and of course everyone was adamant that it was a frivolous lawsuit and that someone shouldn't win millions of dollars for spilling coffee. I could just go to McDonald's, dump some coffee on myself, and become a millionaire. That's so stupid. Then we were told how hot the coffee was and shown slides of blurred images of the burns she received and how the coffee had basically melted her flesh. Ooh. We all thought maybe she was justified. We then had to discuss whether how this new information changed our views. That Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. Albert Einstein. But general public, not being aware that classical Greece and Rome had colored paints all over those statues, much less colored dyes in their clothes. Edit. Point being, we tend to believe that there was a lot of white in the classical period, which isn't actually the case. Related to Rome, gladiators used to advertise for local blacksmiths who provided them armor and weapons. Ridley Scott intended to portray this in Gladiator, but left it out because he felt people wouldn't believe it. The Chinese terracotta army was also originally painted. Not just the statues, but the buildings too. The Parthenon would be very colorful. The traditional image of Socrates lecturing in a white toga is all wrong. It should actually be tie-dye. Same for castles. Things medieval TV and film annoy me as they always seem to have bare stone walls, but they would be very flashy. The White Tower, the Tower of London, is called that because it was painted white with red roses on it too at some point. Ninjas dressed in all black to stay stealthy in the night or something like that. Ninjas dressed like normal people to blend in. The all-black look stemmed from Japanese theater to make it more obvious to the audience who the ninjas were. If they wore all black, it'd be quite obvious, and they'd stick out like a sore thumb edit. Most of you pointed out it also came from stagehands. That makes a lot of sense too. Of course, they didn't wear all black. There were red, white, blue, and later in green ninjas. Also, shuriken got used less as actual weapons and more like a dangerous distraction. And while we're at it, samurai weren't particularly honorable and fought mostly with bows and spears with katanas, only being the third weapon of choice. Wasn't it that the all-black look was worn by the people moving the props in Japanese theater? And then in some plays there was a twist that one of those prop holders attacked the protagonist? Einstein never failed math. The rumor started from Ripley's Believe It or Not, and Einstein actually responded to them saying, "I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus." He wasn't very good at the non-science related classes though, and did fail French. I'm so confused about Einstein and Ripley's Believe It or Not existing at the same time. F's that shit ended up being portrayed on Star Trek Teen when Data played poker with him. Sir Isaac Newton ended up making fun of him for not being able to do simple arithmetic because he couldn't figure out what the bet was. People got confused by the different grading scales. French must be a hard language if even Einstein couldn't get the silent letters right. I think kids who take French should be told this truth rather than math students being told the myth. So many people completely misunderstand pre-industrial lifespans. The average age of death was 30 not because our bodies wore out faster, but because of how averages are calculated. A lot of people died as children. A much larger chunk of the population died in wars. If you got in an accident, healing you without modern medicine was difficult. But for people who reached adulthood and then avoided violence, injury, and plague, living to be 60 or 70 was pretty normal. It's the difference between average lifespan and life expectancy. Almost everything about the medieval times. Our image of it is highly influenced by Hollywood. Plug for the podcast, We're Not So Different, with deep dives on nearly every aspect of medieval society by Eleanor Janiger. Page you specializes in the period. Fascinating stuff. The Boston Tea Party didn't have some grand celebration. A lot of the colonists were confused, and it's recorded as one of Boston's most quiet nights. It's also worth noting that the spark that ignited the Boston Tea Party wasn't a grand protest about taxation without representation. In reality, it was done as retaliation as British Parliament gave the OK for East India, trading co to sell surplus tea directly to the colonies as a cost-cutting measure to prevent East India from going bankrupt. Up until the Tea Act of 1773, East India had a pretty cushy setup. They would sell the tea they made at Dutch auction, since the Dutch had no taxes on imported tea, get the British government to cover the duty cost of doing so, then have merchants import the tea back to their native countries, paying full tax in the process. Due to external factors, including smuggling rings, the Bengal famine of 1770, and the expiration of the Indemnity Act of 1767, the East India Trading Company began hemorrhaging money on the entire arrangement. With the decline of sales from official East India tea and the rise of smuggled tea entering Great Britain, East India was on the brink of bankruptcy. New legislation limited the amount that Parliament was willing to cover for duty, and after failing to come to better agreements, it was eventually decided that in order to save East India, Parliament would allow them to save East India. Parliament would allow them to sell directly to colonies as a way to save costs. And as it turned out, it saved a significant amount of money on importing tea, to the point where East India could afford to undercut smugglers in most places and still turn some level of profit. This also opened up East India to sell to the American colonies directly. It's this move that pissed off the Sons of Liberty. They were already a political group parading themselves as anti-loyalist, who happened to be composed primarily of smugglers and governing officials who had direct ties in the smuggled tea trade. So when East India came knocking with tea cheap enough to undercut the smugglers and screwing over local colonial importers, they got pissed. With enough vocal support behind the taxation, without representation. Movement, they spun the story of East India opening shop in American colonies as just another extension of the British government, levying heavy tax on imported goods that lined their own pockets instead of going back to the colony. Granted, there were other important factors still at play here. Legitimate and law-abiding importers that didn't sign on with East India directly were posed to lose a lot as a result of this ordeal, and it would effectively cement East India as a true monopoly of the tea trade, backed in some capacity by the British government directly, which opened up a very real threat that other commodities on the market could face a similar fate. Plus the real sentiment that this was a decision made by the British government with no input from the colonies was enough to hardwire sentiment against the proposal. In history classes, we were always taught the idea of the Boston Tea Party as being some grand protest in the face of big bad Britain levying higher taxes on essential goods, including tea and other imported goods. But in reality, it was a bunch of politicians and their rich smuggler friends retaliating against a market force that threatened to undercut their grey market business. There were so many loyalists throughout the American Revolution. The Sons of Liberty were a small group of complete radicals that roped the entirety of colonial America, for lack of a better term, into a war that many of them did not really support. That people used swords and axes all the time. Spears. It's spears. Most of human history has been spears. Vikings used spears, samurai and knights used spears, samurai and knights used spears. Hell, bayonets exist because people felt you always need a spear, even with a rifle in your hand. William Blake said, when the stars threw down their spears, yea, and watered heaven with their tears. Which is stupid. No one throws down their spear. Spears are great for poking people to death. Combat is all about hitting a person without being hit yourself. It's why we have been developing stuff to hit each other from further and further away. I blame Hollywood. They want their protagonists to kill lots of people in bloody melees. The reality of clusters of people poking at each other with spears is far less sexy. Part of this is that swords were a big status symbol, as they are basically just you saying, hey, look at all this metal I can afford just to carry it around. Even knights and noblemen would use spears or other polearms first, especially in ranks. Marie Antoinette saying, let them eat cake. Although, as I recall, weren't her last words actually an apology to her executioner for tripping over his foot? Romans indulged in food so much they had a special place to go and vomit so they could eat more. Maybe that has been dispelled by now, but many still believe it. Lols. I know. They did call the exit aisles in theaters and coliseums vomitoriums, but that was because the root word for vomit meant to spew forth, and that's what the audience did at the end of the show. Spewed forth out of the building. This is a little niche, but it's been a long-held belief in the gaming community that one of Nintendo's business ventures before getting into the video game market was love hotels, hourly hotels, whose main purpose is to knock boots in. This has been repeated as fact alongside their other historical ventures, like playing cards, taxis, instant food and toys. But last year, a Nintendo enthusiast did a dive into their historical financial records and found no definitive proof that they ever ran or were associated with love hotels in any way. I've always heard they started out as a playing card company. I had never heard of the others. Interesting. Pretty much most of the common public image of the Stone Age, Paleolithic peoples, didn't primarily live in caves. They were used for habitation sometimes, but tents or even relatively permanent huts were probably far more common. Art caves like those found in France and Spain often show no signs of habitation at all. They weren't stupid, brutish ape people. Anatomically modern humans emerged at least 70, 100, 200 years ago, thanks to several comments who pointed out my mistake. And there's nothing to suggest they would have been intellectually inferior to us. Even Neanderthals probably were relatively close to us, and it's questionable if you'd even realize it wasn't a Homo sapiens if you met one. H. Sapiens definitely, and Neanderthals probably wore ornaments of various kinds. Even H. erectus likely was broadly human in appearance and behavior. You have to go back in time a long way before you'd consider early hominids more animal than human. Generally, even imagining the Stone Age as some sort of coherent period of human history is misleading. It's a periodization based on materials used. Even though there is sometimes a remarkable cultural uniformity over long periods of time and large distances in Stone Age Europe, even single cultures span many thousands of years. Worldviews and even lifestyles must have changed many times, even during periods we now consider uniform. In fact, even the name Stone Age is misleading. A lot of tools were made from flint or similar material, if available, but that's just the material that preserves the best. Wood, bone, clay, plant fibers, furs, etc. were also used. They just usually didn't survive long enough for us to find. It's likely that Southeast Asian pre-metallic cultures even used bamboo in a similar way flint and bone was used in Europe. The idea that Vikings, early medieval Norsemen, were dirty barbarians with shaggy hair and wild beards who wore leathers and furs. In reality, Vikings were notorious for being very clean by medieval standards, bathing every day and washing their hair. They wore shoulder-length, very well-combed hair, which they sometimes lightly bleached with potash to accentuate the blonde. They wore short, very neat beards and carefully trimmed stash. Later on in the Viking Age, some wore undercut kind of a trim, but with longer bangs. Instead of leathers, which they almost never wore, they had woolen clothes in bright colors, with blues and pinks being particularly popular. They almost never wore actual fur. They sold it all and instead wore fake fur made of pulled wool, basically fur rug trims. Instead of crusty savages, they were fabulous, clean and neatly fashionable, to the point that the Church Chronicles of England note that this excessive dandiness was dangerous in itself, because it helped them lead Christian women astray. Still, of course, they were quite often murderers, slavers, thieves and raiders, just fabulous ones. A Stegosaurus fighting a T-Rex. They lived millions of years apart. Stegosaurus 144 lived a million years ago, to Rex 65 million years ago, E-Rex 65 million years ago. Insane difference. Still almost most every dinosaur-related media places them together. Not to mention the inclusion of Dimetrodon in dinosaur media. Dimetrodon lived 115 million years before Stegosaurus, and wasn't even a reptile, let alone a dinosaur. It was a stem mammal. Maybe it's just like a super elderly Stegosaurus that historically people, especially the peasant class of medieval Europe, stank. This is born of two factoids. Firstly, that people very rarely, if ever, had baths, and secondly, that people rarely, if ever, washed their clothes. Both are kind of true, but misleading and with massive caveats. First, bathing. Think of the amount of work involved in preparing a bath in the days before hot running water. You go to the well, get a bucket of water, lug it back across the village to your house, put it in a pan over the fire to heat it up. That's one bucket. You'd have to do that half a dozen times at least. Even if you've got servants to do all the actual work, it would take a lot of servants a lot of time to get you a bath ready. But that doesn't mean people didn't wash. Most people wash daily, using a basin of water and a cloth, basically a sponge bath. Soap made of animal fat and ash has been around for thousands of years and is pretty effective at lifting dirt off the skin, as any one of us who's had to sponge bathe for a while age. After a surgery, will know it may not be ideal, but it gets the job done. Films generally portray peasant with smudges of dirt all over the face, but that's just lazy costuming. And now the clothes. True, the outer layers. The layers that we see were very rarely washed because most people only owned one set and they could be very difficult to wash effectively. But you have to remember people, even peasants, wore a lot of layers so that the layer we see was really the equivalent of a coat and was never really against the wearer's skin gathering sweat. How often do you wash your outer coat? For people in roles where external dirt was very likely to get onto the clothes, aprons and other easily removable garments were used. The layers worn right against the skin, a full dress, like smock for women and a long shirt for men, long enough to tuck around the genitals and butt and also do the job of underpants, were changed and washed as often as possible because they were the layers that got the body sweat, etc. They were made more simply and usually of cheap, hardy fabrics specifically designed for easy laundering. Tile, Dr. Medieval Peasant, were not filthy and stinking. They washed their clothes and bodies as best they could. It should be noted, though, that although the people were not as dirty as sometimes portrayed, the stench of cities is well documented to be so vile as to cause sickness and fainting. London in particular was disgusting. Close, cramped housing with sewage in the open and animals being commonplace led to a pretty horrific atmosphere. I originally studied law at university. In my first year, we did a history of law module. We had a guest speaker once, whose occupation was to create copy smells. He brought with him a sample smell of what London smelled like around the time of the plague. He pre-warned the lecture theatre that it was going to be bad, but my God, this is the worst thing I have ever smelled in my life. And I've done skin decomposition study at one point. He had this tiny glass vial of the stench and put it on a tissue at the front of the theatre. We lasted all of 5 minutes before most people left the lecture. Felt like I could still smell it for a good hour after 2. Told her the people might not have been filthy, but the cities were repulsive. Whatever the fuck is on the History Channel nowadays, I know the exact moment I gave up on the History Channel. A guy came into a pawn shop with a uniform and said, "It's from the war with the Philippines." The guy in the shop said, "There's no such thing as the war with the Philippines. My undergrad senior thesis is on the Philippine American War. It ain't even historical anymore. They should rename it as the Whatever We Feel Like It channel." Lemmings just run off a cliff to their deaths every year. Thanks for that one. Disney. I watched the video of how Disney got us all to believe this. Can't remember where I saw it, but I wish I could remember. And I'm surprised more anti-Disney groups don't bring it up. That Hitler was a raging, shouting maniac in person. I think we want to believe that he would be that way because the idea that someone who was polite and low-key could be so evil is really disturbing. According to his personal secretary and many people who knew him, Hitler rarely showed anger and was subdued but friendly in private. Traudl Junge was there during the incident that inspired the scene in the movie Downfall that became a meme, and she said that she was completely shocked to hear Hitler raise his voice. She had worked for him for over 2 years. I think that's mainly due to his speeches and the clips of him clearly on amphetamine. The man also went out of his way to save particular Jews that were nice to him in his prior life, which, if you think about it, just makes his genocide even worse. He knew that many Jews were good people and chose to indiscriminately kill them anyway. Edit for spelling. Under God was not in the original version of the Pledge of Allegiance. The pledge was written in 1892. It wasn't until 1954 that President Eisenhower added under God in response to fear of communism during World War II. Also, when first implemented, during a pledge, people raised their right arm forward so the hand was level with their eyes, directed at the flag. However, this was changed during World War II because it resembled the Nazi salute. The procedure was changed to place the right hand over the heart. There is a joke saying that Austria's greatest success is making everyone believe that Mozart was Austrian and Hitler was German. Wasn't Mozart from Salzburg? Mozart went from Salzburg to Vienna. Beethoven, as a German composer, on the other hand. Carrots are good for eye health, but won't improve your eyesight. Nevertheless, people have been telling me all my life I should eat carrots to see better. The reason people think that is during World War II, the Royal Air Force had this new radar system, and they didn't want the Germans to know about it. So they spread the rumor that the reason their pilots could find their plane so fast was that they ate carrots. Edit. See top comment below from Willendafoyshukak. Great username. I've probably been duped also. The reason people think that is during World War II, the Royal Air Force had this new radar system and they didn't want the Germans to know about it, so they spread the rumor that the reason their pilots could find their plane so fast was that they ate carrots. Without wanting to get too meta on you, this is also a piece of fiction widely accepted as fact. I found out quite literally 2 days ago. TEPS, UW Scientific American, come article fact or fiction, carrots. Improve your vision. Brian Leggett, assistant curator at the Royal Air Force Museum in London, has a different view. I would say that whilst the Air Ministry were happy to go along with the story, they never set out to use it to fool the Germans, Leggett said. The German intelligence service were well aware of our ground-based radar installation and would not be surprised by the existence of radar in aircraft. In fact, the RAF were able to confirm the existence of German airborne radar simply by fitting commercial radios into a bomber and flying over France, listening to the various radio frequencies. He adds, Carrots are good for your eyes. Ever seen a rabbit with glasses? The Irish famine wasn't just a natural disaster. There was plenty of food in Ireland. It was just exported to Britain. Edit. Clarity. Our staple food for most people was the potato, so the failure of the crop was devastating. However, yes, there was so much food being grown here that was exported. We were also as a people given the option to have food if we denounced our religion, leading to a phrase, taking the soup. To take the soup was to denounce Catholicism and become Protestant. Edit. Spelling. The potato blight was a natural disaster. The famine itself was not. That the Library of Alexandria being burned down set humanity back hundreds or even thousands of years. At the time that it was finally destroyed in 48 DC, most of its collection had already been copied and distributed to other libraries and universities, or the important scrolls were relocated. It was no longer an important meeting place for great scholars either, and it's not entirely clear how much of it was even destroyed during the fire, as many believe that it was even partially rebuilt afterward. It ultimately just fell out of relevance throughout the years and didn't really take any of the information stored within with it. That Hitler had one testicle and Napoleon was short. Also that Himmler had two and that they were small. Bill Clinton did in fact have sex with that woman. Are you talking about sex or sexual relations? That George Washington had wooden teeth. He had false teeth, yes, but they were made of ivory. He never had wooden teeth. I heard that motherfucker had like 30 goddamn dicks. Not sure if quite at the level you're asking for, but it seems to be common knowledge that people didn't fight back against Germans in World War II, and it's because they didn't have guns or were cowards. They fought back a lot. The largest was likely Hatep's, Ken, Wikipedia, or Gukai Warsaw Uprising. It just turns out that normal people fighting against a military tend to do poorly. The Poles in general did a rather good job fighting the Nazis, but when they had to start fighting Nazis and Soviets at the same time, it became impossible.